A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
So for everyone at Ethics and Video Games, I'm Stefan Heinrich Simond. I'm a game studies scholar from Germany.
I'm Dan Hughes, a Japanese scholar from Texas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shlomo Sher. I'm a philosophy professor and video game ethicist from Los Angeles.
Hello, Study in Pixels people. My name is Andy Ashcraft, and I am a game designer, and I teach game design.
Wow! Welcome everybody, everywhere.
This is very exciting.
This is our first time to collaborate. So this is a co-podcast collaboration.
Yes.
Studying Pixels and the Ethics of Video Games podcast. And what are we talking about, Stefan?
Yeah, we're talking about the ethics of piracy, because the thing is that over the course of our shows, several times we hit upon the subject of piracy, and we never really found our position. And we always thought, we need to talk to someone who has some expertise on the matter. And that's when I reached out to you, Shlomo. So what we really are curious about is the moral philosophical positions on piracy. Are there any conditions under which piracy can be morally permissible? That would be a key question that we have to answer.
Okay, so that's our idea. First of all, let me say, I wouldn't say I have high expertise in the piracy specific issue, but piracy is like many other, like many other activities that we engage in, and there's of course kind of classic ethical reasoning ways to think about these things. I'm assuming, first of all, that none of us has engaged in piracy ever.
Never.
No, we're all good boys, I think.
So, general listeners, you should know that we've been chatting about this before we started recording, and we've all, yes,
Yes.
Even you, Andy,
a little bit, not much,
a little bit,
sure.
Okay, I figure in your younger years,
in my poorer years.
Okay, right. It's interesting because my assumption is that as the game designer, you would be the one of us who is least most likely to have pirated, and I'm assuming that still is the case, that you still have pirated less than the rest of us.
I'm sure that will be the case when we get into it. I'll be the one saying, "Hey, don't steal my work."
It's funny because when Stefan and I had talked about this before, we always ended every conversation with, we really don't know where we stand. We should really look into it more. And just talking to you, Andy, briefly, it's just, no, I know exactly where I stand. Thank you very much.
The interesting thing is that Andy just said, don't steal my work. And I was wondering, does piracy equate to stealing? Because I do remember from when I was a child, let's say child to teenage years, I always had the situation that I used to pirate a whole lot of video games. I'm just going to admit that, right? I went to the movie rental and then I got a disc and then I cracked the game or got a key gen or whatever. And then I kept it. So technically I stole, but my parents, they would never get upset about it. Whereas on the other hand, if I were to go to a store and I would steal a bit of chewing gum, which I never did, but I assume if I had done that, my parents would be super angry and would be like, no, you ought not to steal. Don't do that. That's bad. That's a weird disparity, isn't it?
Right. And, I don't know about you, Dan, but when I first started getting games illegally, and I don't even know if we called it pirating back then, getting cracked games, but I was I think 14 maybe. And this was 1986. And I would go to what we call duck meets. I was in a computer science magnet back then, and I would take my Commodore 128 along with the screen and everything to some sort of auditorium, and there would be a whole group of people there, and we would all be. Some of them had hard drives as big as 2 megabytes, and we would be essentially copying cracked games, directly to each other, right? and I never remotely thought there was anything wrong with that until years later when people started talking about music piracy, right? In which go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say, my experience was kind of similar because I went to a boarding school where we had a local kind of intranet, and all of these games, some lunatic had cracked a bunch of different games and put them all onto. It was accessible to everybody, so it was just kind of commonplace that if you wanted to play the latest game, you'd just wait for this guy to put it up, and you'd get it downloaded onto your laptop. So I was about 14 too, and it didn't cross my mind, I think mainly because that was just what was done at the school,
Right.
but I never had the thought that, oh, I'm doing something bad here
Right.
until a little later.
And it turns out, like when you're in school too, there's all this stuff that is just free and shared.
Right.
Right.
All of your books, the library, there's a library there. There's, you would never actually take home a library book and keep it, but you would have no problem just going and getting a library book and reading it and taking it back. Right. And like,
it's funny to think the JSTOR of video games. It was just access to everything. That's kind of what it was too.
Except Jay's a friend of yours, and all of these are illegally pirated games, right?
That's right.
So to answer Stefan's question, right? I think we can start kind of with the what I'm thinking here is kind of one extreme of the issue, which is I forgot where I got these categories from, but the category is called the fundamentalist protectors. And the idea there is essentially exactly the way Stefan put it is, look, if you're essentially pirating video games, what you're doing is essentially exactly analogous to common theft. There really is no different, right? People have a right to their stuff, right? Their creation is their stuff, right? Notice their stuff is their property, right? Taking it or accessing it without permission is plain stealing and needs to be punished in the exact same way as stealing is. So if you guys remember, and I'm sure you do, the kind of warnings for pirating warnings that you would get on video games, they seem very much to take kind of this idea, right? Pirating is stealing. This is exactly the same as stealing. But, obviously, if you ask somebody what's wrong with stealing, what they would say is, well, if you stole my laptop, what's wrong is I don't have a laptop anymore, right? Your gain is my loss. But in piracy, when we don't have an analogous situation. We have something that in some ways is analogous, potentially, but certainly there seems to be an important difference between the two.
Yeah,
And
it's
the-
like
Go
this
ahead,
level
Stefan.
of abstraction, I think, that really influences our intuition when we think about that. Because yes, like if I crack a game from some kind of publisher, let's say I crack a game from 2K, then 2K did not lose that game; they can still sell it, but I basically deprived them of that one sold copy of the revenue of that one sold copy, right?
that's right.
Or you potentially deprive them, right? And this is where things get weird, right?
Yeah.
And then we have the other point that the fundamentalist protector is going to make, which is to say, a lot of times people say piracy is not a victimless crime, but illegal downloading harms creators in terms of, this would be lost income, right?
Yep.
So, right, you're not stealing what they have, but you're stealing what they're going to get, right? And this is it, but this is the key. The key is that this is important enough, right, to be counted as serious as common thievery, because you're still even if you're not stealing what they currently have, in stealing what they're going to have, you're still stealing in the exact normal way that we talk about stealing, right?
Right. And some people will argue that well, I'm not stealing what they're going to get because I was never going to buy it.
Right. And there's a lot of arguments this way. In fact, there's examples, and I think the most famous one is Game of Thrones, where piracy made Game of Thrones more popular, right? Piracy actually led to more people watching Game of Thrones, to more people paying for Game of Thrones, I think to more HBO subscriptions as well.
It would be hard to prove that. It would be
I was gonna
really
say,
hard
yeah.
to prove that.
Um, Fair enough, Andy. Um, this is certainly. I've read this in a couple of places. Um, it certainly doesn't seem though like it's beyond the uh, you know beyond imagining that something can get popular through piracy to the point where enough people are interested to actually help the IP itself. Right.
Yeah, but it's
And
also something where just it's make a significant difference of whether you can afford it technically, right? Because I found some statistics. It's a little bit hard to find good data on the matter. The only like big survey that I could find was from 2016 from PC Gamer. They did like an online survey with 50,000 people, and I found there that up until the age of 25, the most common reason for why people would pirate games is that they say they can't afford it. And that calls into question this entire idea of if I would not have pirated, would I have then bought the game? If I can't afford it, have I really deprived a company of that sale? You know, because I wouldn't have bought it anyway.
Right,
right.
right. And to that I say that there's probably a percentage of people for whom that is true. And that percentage is important because let's say it's 90%. 90% of the people who pirate games can't afford them. We'll just pull a number out of the air, right? That means that there's 1 out of 10 who can. And so every time 10 people download the game, I'm losing 1 sale. So really what you're stealing is 10% of the revenue.
Yeah, I also have
Interesting.
to say that admittedly, this survey, obviously people just simply participated in that survey and might not have told the truth. But according to their percentages, it's roughly around like between 50 to 60% of people younger than the age of 25. They said the reason for why they pirate video games is because they can't afford them.
I wanna add a little something to this, which is cognitive biases. We have to remember our psychological cognitive biases.
Yeah.
Are people really rationalizing when they say they can't afford it?
Mm.
You know, what does it mean to say that you really can't afford it? Does it mean that you don't want to save up to get this thing? Um, because in many cases, that's exactly what that would be, right? I
Does it,
mean,
does it mean that I can't afford it because I really want this Frappuccino?
Yeah. Yeah.
right. I mean, you know, what does that exactly mean? I mean, so I used to really, I used to collect a lot of music, right, in the days of CDs, right, and I bought hundreds of CDs at full price, right, as a student with because it was my passion, you know, and some of those were shitty CDs with no refund policy. And I kind of want to get into that later because I think refund is kind of really important. The thing is really important here. But you know, could I afford them? Well, I could afford them if I skimped on other things. And I think the same applies in some cases to games, and that for a lot of us that say that, it's not so much that we can't afford them, is that we are rationalizing it for ourselves why it's okay to get it for free when really if it really came down to it we could afford, let's say, half of those games or a quarter of those games, right, but some amount. And if this was our passion, if pirating wasn't an option, I'm willing to bet that that number would go up. But
Yeah.
in the same sense, um, from the game designer perspective, there would be a kind of we're all kind of looking for with confirmation bias to kind of looking for the evidence that to show that we're already right. So from the game designer perspective, I would assume that there would also be self-serving biases about the value and of the wrongness involved in pirating video games. Though it might not be as bad, to be honest, as as the rationalizations that so many of us would have, I think.
Right.
I
I do
assume
know
that
that it's certainly when you're thinking about the harm that it causes somebody. Indie game developers are have a hard time making a living anyway. So try if you're going to rationalize away pirating games, make sure you're pirating from the big guys and not the indie guys. Uh,
which is interesting. In my contemporary moral issues class, I've asked students about what do they think the punishment should be if you steal something like $250 worth of clothes from Target, and the majority of them are like, "Oh, Target, oh, they're a big company, very little, not a big deal." And it's interesting that notice, so this isn't just with um, indie developers, right? It's with any kind of like big company and small retailer. Do you guys think that's true, Dan and Stefan?
Well, so speaking as someone who also has an insurance background, it's funny to me when I hear the argument of, Walmart, Target, they're huge companies. If you steal a candy bar, or if you steal even something like $250 worth of clothes, they have loss prevention. They eat that cost. And what you don't think about when you rationalize it that way is, yeah, but then we're all paying for it in premiums and money that's going up anyway. So it seems like you're kind of sticking it to the man by taking something like that. And I think the argument probably persists with big AAA video games. Like, well, what is Activision losing? I'm taking this game. Well, there's a lot of people who work at Activision who see ramifications of that, I would imagine, at some level. So to me, I think it's maybe easier with video games when especially if you're cracking a game, because it's not a tangible product. So you're not actually walking out of the store with it.
Right.
You can, that's your first level of rationalization. And then beyond that, you say, well, I didn't really take any money from them. But I think broader picture, there's a lot of ramifications that we don't think about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also think that this idea of stealing from big corporations is, let's say, more acceptable than stealing from an indie dev. Or like, would you steal from Toby Fox? Most people would probably say like, no, of course not, because there's so much passion in these video games and it's just one person making all of that and he has to sustain himself on these games. I think it's a bit of a problematic rationale, because we have to then kind of determine at which degree do we draw a line, which is like super difficult from a moral philosophical perspective. And we have to also, as you said, Dan, I 100% agree with that. We have to consider that there are people working at Activision, and theft or like pirating games is probably not going to hurt Bobby Kotick or soon Phil Spencer as much as it is going to hurt like the people that actually work there, that might not even be involved in the development itself, but maybe other kind of staff members that work in, like on the lower end salary spectrum. So I think it's a problematic rationale.
Will
for
it
sure.
really though, Andy?
I can actually sort of talk to that a little bit. So when you're in a big company like an Activision or an EA, publicly traded company, you have what you're really going to do is if you manage through hundreds of millions of people downloading your games for free and not paying anything, what you're going to end up doing is just they simply will focus their game. They'll focus the money that they have on the 3 titles that they know that will make them the most money. And you'll end up just cutting into the diversity of games that are being produced by these companies, because they won't be able to make the profits that they need in order to sustain the diverse, small, interesting games.
That's interesting.
Games that they might be able to do something really, really great with because they have a bigger reach. There's a real good reason for why a game developer might want to go and get published with a big company and not just put their game out as an indie studio, and that is because of the reach of these companies and the publishing might. And so, you're potentially, taking a game. They're potentially saying, "Oh, well, we're not going to publish this small game because, we need to focus our interests on Madden and Call of Duty, and and the 13th, 14th sequel of whatever this other game is. I don't know.
Whatever it is.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting to think about, because I remember one of our previous conversations was around Metroid Dread, which had all of this great press and people really loved it, but it was also a lot of people were pirating it, if I remember correctly, to kind of upscale it and mod it for themselves to make it look better. So that's another topic we could get into. But I remember when that happened, the discourse around it was, if we're not buying Metroid Dread, we'll never get another game like that, because they'll just see, okay, well, that didn't do so well. I don't care how many people pirated or played it. It didn't sell like we were hoping, so we're not going to make another project like that, and we'll focus on, I don't know, Animal Crossing DLC or something, right?
That's
So
exactly right.
Especially what you said, Andy. Adding to that point, I could also imagine that there is then, of course, a trend to develop live service games, multiplayer games. Those would be the big franchises that we already referenced, because those are significantly harder to pirate, because you need to be online in order to play them, and there are like DRM checks running in the background that will make it harder. So then you think, well, where are we making the most money? In
That's
such
right.
games, possible.
Not to mention that you're moving everything to microtransactions. Where you just
And there's
can't
no surprise.
pirate them.
There's no surprise that these two things, these two aspects, have coincided where they have. Right, the growth of DRM and the growth of anti-piracy stuff has paralleled the growth of anti of like online purchases and free-to-play models and those sorts of things, pretty much directly. That's because a solution for one thing offers game potential for the other.
I wanna, if we can, we talked about the kind of the fundamentalist protectors. I'm wondering if we can now go to the other
Yes, please. I'm
side of the
curious.
spectrum. Right?
Is this-
And
is this-
absolutely.
I also want to bring in, and this is probably the place to bring it in,
Okay.
the idea of the tragedy of the commons, because isn't that what this is? Isn't the internet our big commons? We could just go and like download stuff.
Right. So the tragedy of the commons would be that it's in each of our interests to download this pirated games. But if all of us do it, no one pays for games and there's no games.
Right.
Yeah, that's great, Andy. Yeah, but of course, the question is going to be, are we in a situation where we're all in the same place? And I think one of the situations again is the who can afford it. So let me say something about the fundamentalist libertarians here. And what that position is going to be like, and then let's see if we can get somewhere in the middle. So, the fundamentalist libertarians are going to say, look, all information should be free, right? All information, all ideas, all creative products should be free, available to everyone. And one reason for that is, look, the world would just be a better place if we did this, right? People would get more access to more books, more software, more games that they otherwise wouldn't be able to play. Piracy is especially common in places that just really, it's easy for us to talk about when I was a kid I couldn't afford it, but if you're a kid growing up in Vietnam or Nigeria or lots of places across the world, the norm is that everything is pirated because you really can't afford it, right? So this idea of games spreading in places where affordability is a real issue. And I remember traveling in 1994 in the Middle East and in Europe, and everywhere people were poor. Um, no one was selling actual tapes. Everything was pirated, right? That was just the expectation because it was outrageous given the relative amount of money people locally had to charge. Let's say I can get a pirate tape for $2, but it would be like $14 or $15 if it was like the regular version. It was almost insulting to sell it at that price to that population. And mind you, I think that's a difficult question everywhere where you have, because if you were going to sell it for less than that, those people can turn around with those legitimate copies and make a profit out of them, right? This would happen. You think about pharmaceuticals, which is a really
Sure.
big pirating, if we call it pirating, right? But IP kind of situation. If you were to sell pharmaceuticals really cheap to like a poor country, obviously there would be corruption that would use it to sell it for more money to, a less poor country.
Yeah,
So,
those pharmaceuticals would just end up back in the U.S.
or maybe back to the U.S. where they can get the most money for them,
Right.
right? Um, but that is a real issue for a big part of the world. That's kind of the way they can get games in the first place, and then maybe they can still with that give something to the game company. For example, maybe this is where microtransactions can come into play. So they can't do the whole game, but they can do things here and there. And the other people here is. Sometimes people pirate because things are just not available in their area, right? I mean, I think that's less and less the case. But certainly that's been the case with movies a lot in the past. And then to me, this is the kind of interesting part. So, for music, once Napster came about, I was all over Napster. By that point, I think I had something like 600 or 700 CDs in my collection. So I had like a wall covered with CDs. But once Napster came, I almost immediately stopped buying CDs. Um, because Napster allowed me the ability to uh, download music, the music I wanted, download music without penalty. And then BitTorrent came where I could literally like download a collection of 100 gigabytes of MP3s.
Yeah.
Right? And I could all check it out later. Now that essentially, that essentially seemed to spell doom for the music industry. But it also led to things like people listening to music on YouTube. It led to today. I have a Spotify subscription, and also I have a subscription to Curaz, which is Cubase. Which is awesome. It's like a high fidelity music streaming where you can stream
cool.
at 28,000 K per second instead of like what would be your normal MP3. High end MP3 is 320. This is 28,000. It sounds amazing, and I can stream it into my stereo system, and it's just like
I can't
listening to
imagine that I
music
would be able to
before.
tell the difference. As a layman, I would not be able to tell the difference between those music streams.
Part of the reason is I haven't listened to a CD in 20 years or almost because MP3s made things so convenient. But once you kind of get back into high fidelity, you're like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And because of the whole MP3 Napster kind of threat to the CD model, they came up with these services. And now I pay through services. Now I realize the services maybe don't pay small artists as well as big artists, though maybe that was always the case with labels to some way. But at least you've got something like this, and I think those things kind of matter, that sometimes pirating could be a push to give people something different that might even be better. I don't buy that many games these days because mostly me and my son play whatever 100 or 150 games we have on Xbox, on our subscription model to Xbox. And we really like that subscription, right? I mean, there's so many games there for us. Maybe we don't need to go pirate games. Notice that's kind of another way to and within that package, you can also fit the smaller games that might get lost to pirating.
That's
I
right.
think
That's been the industry. Like that's the way the industry is sort of focused. They've gone with these sort of and music industry too, right? They've gone with these subscription policies, or they've gone with free to play, where basically it doesn't make any sense to go through the hurdles of pirating a game when it costs you free or $1, or and you could just get it really easily by this with a really nice interface, and people actually paying attention to what your user experience is. It's just a better experience. And so, sure, I'll pay $1 for the better experience.
I think to be kind of the devil's advocate here, because this is always the sticking point for me on the subject of accessibility and availability. I always think I love streaming services. I think they're fantastic. Spotify, any of the, Netflix, Disney Plus, whatever it is, right? I think that they're great. But what worries me is things go away from them. right? Licenses kind of change, or people, they get removed, or
Right.
things go away. It's not the same as having the physical copy. And the troubling thing about video games, especially, is that when you're talking about game, sort of, I guess, like being a librarian for games or a historian for them, there are certain games that they just either don't physically exist anymore, or they're very difficult to find and they don't digitally exist. So there's this kind of feeling that if you want to experience a game that isn't remastered or re-released or on a streaming service, you're kind of out of luck. And that's where the kind of, to put on my romantic hat for a minute, feels like it's like withholding art from people. And that's the thing that I always struggle with, especially not just, here in America or in Europe or in, North America, wherever, but the global South, places that you mentioned, Shlomo, where it's just like, you can't even get normal games normally. Like how would we expect people to dig into game history?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, because game technology has moved forward, at a rate of Moore's law. And so I have a Dreamcast, and so I can play my old Dreamcast games. But if I didn't have that Dreamcast, this would be a coaster, right? This disc would be, a useless item to me, and there would be no way for me to play this game again. And of course, if I wanted to play a Dreamcast game that I didn't have, if I couldn't find it in one of the used bins somewhere in a used game store, I would have to figure out a way to play this game. And as an educator, I frequently want to play games that are no longer, in being published, no longer. So, this is, I think, the idea of like, there should be a library for games that have fallen out of print.
Yeah, I think unavailability is certainly one of the strongest reasons why piracy can be morally legitimate, because you're preserving art, you're preserving culture, and you wouldn't have been able to purchase it anyway if it's like properly unavailable.
You're not depriving anybody of anything. Nobody's expecting any royalties from the 20-year-old Dreamcast game.
Exactly. Though the thing is that, especially like streaming services, but also, as you, Dan, said, remasters and remakes are really trying to counter that, right? Or these, mini consoles, NES Mini, SNES Mini. Maybe there would be a Dreamcast Mini at some point, or you get the Dreamcast collection on some kind of Sega mini console. I think these are all endeavors to make games available, which then again delegitimize piracy, morally delegitimize it.
And I think this is a real difference between games and music, right? Because we can listen to music now that we bought 40 years ago. We don't have any problems. I mean, maybe you don't have a record player. I don't have a record player, but I know people who do have record players. And if I find, a piece of vinyl that I want to listen to, I can very easily solve that problem. CDs are starting to, CD players are starting to like fall out of production, right? You buy a new car, you no longer comes with a CD player. So, maybe that 600 CD wall that Shlomo has is going to be all coasters at some point.
They're all gone. Or they're deep in the closets, but there were coasters for a while. And then there was that time when I think there was a moment in kind of a cultural history where people are like, what else can you do with a CD object?
Right.
There you go. Oh,
nice. Do have it.
Is that like a CD made to look like a vinyl? That's great.
Yeah, that's a vinyl. I used to collect vinyl records, and I had to sell my entire collection because I was moving places and needed furniture. Instead, I got these actual coasters.
Right. Nice. Right.
Actual coasters. There you go.
There's also, to me, part of what's interesting about video games and piracy is kind of the question of how the medium is really different. And, it's interesting how one of the things that really bothered me so you think about the things that led to music piracy. A big part of it was you bought a record, and the record, like you've heard one song on the radio, and I went to a record shop a few months ago with all I just got a record player, and I went to like a record shop, and I was like, God damn it, I can't listen to these records. I have no idea what most of these records are. I'm expected to, and they're expensive, to spend like $40 on a record without being able to and back then it was like, let's say, $18 on a CD, which was still like in the, let's say, if you're like the mid
It was
90s, I mean
expensive.
that's a lot, right? But it was the only way you can get the product that you wanted. There weren't any other formats, and there was no refund policy on that. It wasn't like you can always sell it to a used music store, but to me, there was an injustice in that in the first place, right?
Mhm.
And one thing that things like Napster did is allowed you to get exactly what you want and no more of that. And once companies responded by selling songs bit by bit, so you would pay 99 cents for a song or something like that, that at least addressed one of the problems the industry had. Um, and like, once you got streaming services, that really kind of addresses a lot of the other kind of problems. And to me, I'm kind of wondering if games have any similar thing to that. I will say that I think games are incredibly fairly priced. And in my opinion, if you're buying a good game, it's really cheap, like, for the amount of entertainment that you're getting. The only question is there a sufficient return policy? Because if you're paying 60, $70 for a game, or even $30, do you have a way to return it? Because you have no way, to really know what that game is like. And ads are so
Is that
often
true, though?
misleading in games. What was that, Andy?
Is that true that you don't really know what the game is like? When you're talking about $60 or $70 games, you're talking about the AAA titles that are getting a
Right.
lot of
Sure.
press.
Well, I mean, statistically, at least, I just checked it, and the reason demo the game, that is the second most popular reason for why people say they pirate games. And after the age of 25, it is the most popular, because I assume, as people get older, they have a little bit more money at their disposal, a
Right.
little bit more disposable income. And that's why demoing the game becomes more important to them.
Though
think-
Andy's kind of Andy's kind of
Oh, no,
right. I
go
mean,
for it.
these days you can watch so many walkthroughs of a game. Though you may not. I don't like watching walkthroughs. I know it'll give me an idea of the game, but then I'm seeing someone. I want to be exposed to the game in kind of an original
I mean,
way.
it's always better to play the game. Like the feel of the game is going to be different when you're playing it yourself than when you're watching somebody else play it. But no, so that's a fair point. It used to be that demos were free, that people made demos. Here's another aspect that I want to bring in, and because you're talking about games having a fair price, and that's the other way that, again, when we're talking about these big AAA games, so we're not talking about mobile games, or we're not talking about free to play games. We're talking about this very
Right.
niche market. I mean, it's a big niche, but it's still a niche market within the whole video game universe.
Fair enough.
And that's that AAA market, and it's $60 or $70. The people that buy AAA games, when we know, as an industry, we know that you buy a certain number of them every year. It's a low number. It's probably 10, 12. You probably don't buy that many of these AAA games a year, which means from the marketing departments of these companies, when they see you, what they're seeing is a pile of money that is about $600.
Well, at least they're
Right.
honest about it.
Right. And so they want you to buy their game. They want you to spend that $600 on their games. And they know that you have $600 to spend on games. So the best way to do that is to make those games more expensive, not less expensive.
Okay.
Assuming you're
And make you
assuming you're
to spend your money on their game as opposed to because it's super competitive, right? It's a super
Right.
competitive market. And
So
so
why
I
more
think-
expensive instead of less expensive?
because they
Well,
know
the idea would
you have
be-
$600 and they want all of it. If they could sell you one game for $600, they would.
And they do, if you consider that you have games. We talk about these things like full price games versus microtransactions, almost as if they are separate things. But indeed, over the years, these things have so much converged that you pay for. I remember that I purchased, like, I think an Assassin's Creed Valhalla for like $80, and there was still additional stuff to purchase on top, and then an additional in-game shop for cosmetics, because that's, I assume, and I think is a very interesting rationale, to maximize profit and to get as close as possible to those $600.
Right.
That's exactly
I
right.
guess the idea being, all right, if you're going to buy 12 games, I, as AAA Company 1, am assuming that 9 of those will probably not be bought with me. So I'm going to make my 3 as expensive as possible, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Yep.
Though, again, for the amount of, let's say, the Assassin's Creed Valhalla, right? I mean, I put 60, 80 hours into that for the amount of money that we're talking about. It's such a great value, right?
It's a wonderful value. It's absolutely a wonderful value. And the people who put their heart and souls into making these games, and they're huge teams, they're absolutely well worth the money. But I'm just saying,
you like
from
it,
a point of view, you are a pile of $600.
I was about to say, like,
but my point with the return policy is that I think if there's an unfair return policy, that's another potential justification that might not be a terrible justification for especially if you want to demo it. But if I don't know how many people really are like, I'm going to demo it and then pay full price. I wouldn't. But
I've demoed it, now I'm going to complete
honestly,
it.
I mean, almost all of this stuff is being sold on the app stores now.
Right.
And, so almost none of this is box product, where you go to a store and you buy a box and take it home and install it.
Right, but the idea is still the same, isn't it? That
to a degree. Yeah, there should be a simple return policy, and that would be easy, right? I want to demo this game. Let me download the demo version, and it's and it's half an hour long.
I think Steam has that policy. It might not be for every game, but it's if you've only logged 2 hours in this game, you can get your money back. And so things like that, I think, are reasonable.
I think those are great.
And I'm struck by piracy as this sort of competitive force against the industry, where it's like, okay, let's look at piracy. Why are people pirating games? Well, they want to be able to try them out. Okay, make that possible digitally, right? And then they'll stop pirating games. I think that, I mean, just with the music industry example, you see this back and forth to the point where now, if I just want one song off an album, I'm not beholden to buy that entire album. I can just buy the one song or stream it or listen to it on YouTube and donate to the artist in some other way, or patronize them in some other way. And I think that
I consume most of my music over YouTube now.
Yeah. Where it's free.
Yeah.
Right.
Talking maybe coming back to the Napster thing, that's something that I've been chewing on a little bit, because I understand the comparison, and on the other hand, I feel like when it comes to the cultural history of video games, there is something profound about piracy that is deeply inscribed within its culture, with like the cracker scene, the demo scene, and so on. Especially like in the 80s and 90s, it was so common to even make your own title screens for video games, where it was not even something where you wanted to hide that it was a pirated copy, but you essentially added something or made a change, which is not something that happens usually on Napster. Almost like as if piracy is kind of a part of video game culture, part of video game aesthetics even.
That's a good point too, because in the early days of video games, there was a business model of shareware, right? Where you're literally like, this is made to be shared. And, there will be some way of monetizing it, and, some other ways, down the line. But that was a model, and people got used to that as a model, right? I can just share software.
But there was also a hacker culture involved in it. So you would get cracked by, and this would be a thing where you get to show off your skills, right? And other people can know that you're a badass because they're getting a game that was cracked by you.
That's right.
Well, and then you have these sort of weird recursive examples where you have, so Stefan, you mentioned Toby Fox earlier. He got his start with a ROM hack of Earthbound, and then or one of the mother games, and then he made Undertale as sort of an answer to it, and now he's working for Nintendo as a musician. So it's this interesting thing where, oh well, okay, if I look at that, it does kind of seem like you're legitimizing it to some degree, where
it's
you're
not even
bringing this guy in,
Yeah, it's not even a rare example if you think about the fact that games like Doom or Quake were part of this entire shareware culture, I think, where it was like kind of, wasn't it the case that id Software, when they made Doom, they even made like their level editors and everything freely available to people so they could mod the game, change the game, make their own levels, and just say, like, go to town, you don't have to invest extra money in this. And that's part of why Doom became so popular and now sells such tremendous figures.
But it's pretty clear that this is right. It's, we're going to define pirating as essentially, which it's interesting we haven't defined pirating.
That's true,
right?
We
right?
haven't.
Right. But it's interesting, right? Where you're essentially getting your hands on something that the company sees as its product, right? That's something that's not something the company is giving to you. So if they're giving you the ability, obviously they're to them that's not the product, right?
That is true. That is true. That's not piracy. It's shareware, and shareware as such is made for sharing. That's why it's
Right.
not pirating. It's like as if a bakery says, "Here you have a bun for free," then you can't say, "I stole a bun."
Right. There is something that we've talked about that we haven't talked about yet that I thought I'd throw into the conversation.
By the way, we're about 45 minutes.
Great. That one of the things that kind of gets involved in piracy is the question of fairness, right? If you're essentially pirating your games, essentially you're relying on other people subsidizing your gaming experience, right? And that itself, right, just seems unfair, right? You're refusing to participate in the game economy. You're forcing other people to essentially pay for you. Um, the element unfairness to me, again, it's I think partly related to what is it that you actually can afford, what is realistic, and I don't know if there's a hard line here, or I certainly I don't know what I exactly think about it, but certainly there's at some point where, again, I think our rationalization about what we can afford take us a really, really long way. And there's a point where um, we have to remember that other people are subsidizing, our gameplay. People that may just be ones who maybe have more, I don't know, more of a moral sense that we do, that it's important to do the right thing and they see pirating as wrong. Or maybe people who don't have the access to pirating technologies, but are still, supporting the industry just by buying games. Or people that really can't afford it. But the whole thing seems unfair in terms of just you're relying on other people to keep things going for your benefit.
Right. And I think that's a marketing question and a business model question, right? There's tons and tons of freeware free to play games that rely on, hundreds of millions of players rely on a small handful of people who pay for everything.
Right. That's true.
And that's a
right?
business model. That's just a business model.
But wouldn't it be possible to flip it on its head, that argument? Because it is the case that then the people that pirate, they rely on the funding basically of others. But on the other hand, we also kind of made that argument that if you really can't afford a game, or if it is entirely unavailable to you, then we see it as less morally problematic. So that wouldn't that mean that the more money you have and the more access to games and video game culture you have, the less it is possible to legitimize your piracy, and that's why such people that definitely, surely ought to buy games, whereas people that have less money and less access, for them it can be rather legitimate, and that can be a way to restore this kind of fairness.
Absolutely. It's
think I agree
basically
with that,
my
yeah.
the definition of my politics: eat the rich.
Yeah.
Wait,
Yeah,
we're going back here to EA and Activision, right?
Well, I I think that for this has been really enlightening for me, because I always feel like we come to a place where we say, well, it's kind of this gray area, but I almost feel like, all right, I'm a little happier in the gray, in the sense that I think what we just described, and Andy, what you brought up about how you're going to get stuck with the same kind of games because those are the ones that sell if we engage in this, right? I think that where I would probably land is that you, if you have the capability, truly, right, then don't rationalize it. You should pay for your games, right? But where it starts getting kind of gray is, okay, well, what if it's a game that's not published anymore and you want to experience it? I'm a little more lenient on that kind of
Yeah,
situation.
absolutely.
I think.
Well, that one you don't even have a choice, so I don't know,
Right.
what's there to be lenient
What's the
about,
problem?
right?
Yeah,
Right.
Your
Um,
choice is not to experience it, right?
yeah,
I,
right.
I do want to add something that maybe hasn't been said, which is uh, pirated games give millions of people great joy. And this is kind of the utilitarian in me speaking, that it really kind of needs to be remembered, right? In some ways the world is a better off place because people pirated games and have greatly enjoyed these games. Not to dismiss the downside that Andy
Hmm.
is raising, because I think it's real. But I think the other point that Andy raised that was particularly interesting is, um, the free to play model, right? Once because we're in the days where free to play is so common, are there really legitimate reasons for pirating today, now that now that we do have this free to play model that's so common, that's subsidized by whales, and that leads to its own problems, but
Hmm.
at least maybe it doesn't allow for give us reason to pirate, and that we do have kind of streaming bundling services that most gaming platforms are doing, that are affordable. $15 a month is what I pay, I think, and that's affordable certainly to Westerners, if not most people across the world,
Hmm.
if gaming is your passion. Are there still reasons to pirate today, giving these changes? And maybe these changes were partly led by pirating fears, and I don't know about that, but maybe they take away a lot of the reasons to do it in the first place.
That's what I think, and that's what the industry is hoping, of course. And I don't know the numbers. I couldn't tell you whether it's true, but I suspect it probably is. I suspect that all of these things have made piracy a lot less interesting for people to do.
Yeah, it's more cumbersome. You have to be more invested in the technology behind it, and you don't know whether it works. And worst case scenario, you get fined. It makes it a lot less attractive. And I think, especially if we consider that, you asked Shlomo, is there any reason for why people should pirate? I don't have any empirical data to back that up, but I would suppose that a lot of people pirate games, and I'm not justifying that, because they want to play new games when they come out, before they enter into these streaming services, before they are available on sale. And I think that is probably one of the least justifiable reasons for pirating games.
Yes.
Right,
The sheer thrill of piracy.
well, no, it's more than that. I mean,
Yep.
it's a good point, right? A game comes out, you're not going to get it in these bundled streaming services. You still want to play it. Oh, so all that desire to do that is going to be there, and you don't know if it'll be if it'll ever be in these streaming services, and how long you'll have to wait for it. And I mean, okay, so the motivation can certainly still be there. Whether it's justified, I guess, still relies on some of the other things that we talked about today.
Now, I've got one brief question, and that's just a proper gray area, which is let's plays and playthroughs. Only briefly, we can't go into the subject at length, but I'm wondering, that is kind of an area where publishers and developers seem to just have some kind of silent agreement with, sometimes explicit, but often silent or implicit agreement with YouTubers, that you can just take my game and you can play through all of it and put it up on YouTube, and people can watch it then and might not buy it and just say, I'll just watch it on YouTube. Is that something that is kind of the contemporary form, maybe even replacement of this hype of piracy in the 80s and 90s that we're seeing?
In my opinion, no, because the play is the thing. To misquote the Bard, playing a game is so much different, as Shlomo talked about before. It's so much different to play a game than it is to watch somebody play a game. Certainly, the story, like you could potentially reveal things in the story, or like things that you wanted to be surprises. As a game designer, there are things that I like to surprise and delight. We talk about surprise and delight a lot in game design. Like, I want to surprise and delight my players, and if they've seen it on YouTube, then they don't get that surprise and delight. But maybe they don't get the surprise, but they still get the delight because playing it's different. And so I think playing it is so much different than it is to watch it, that oftentimes I think that the publishers don't worry so much about the YouTube. The benefit of people talking about it on YouTube and creating that community of people who are players and having stuff for that community of people to do and talk about and ways of discussing things is more valuable than sales that might be lost because somebody watched the YouTube video and decided they didn't need to play it.
I also think I agree with that, and I think that this is harder to prove. But there is an old YouTube channel; it's defunct now. It was called Two Best Friends Play, and it was one of the early Let's Play channels on YouTube. And they kind of cut their teeth by looking at older games that people maybe didn't hear about or they didn't know about, and a lot of those games, whether through any influence from these folks who they had a big audience, a lot of them have come back into public discourse. And so it's interesting that you're showcasing this old thing that you had a lot of love for, and maybe that sparks another installment or some more work for people, or who knows, right? I don't know how you could quantify that, but I feel like, as you say, you're not taking away the core experience of playing from someone if you're just showing it. You're basically doing a long form advertisement in a lot of different ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I do. There is one thing I do want to, there's a note that I would like to sign off on though, if I can. At the end of the day, in 20 years when I retire, I would like to, retire in some comfort from the money that I've made in my video game career. But honestly, when somebody comes up to me and says, "Oh, I played your game when I was a kid," that is what I love. Like, I remember playing your game when I was a kid. I liked that game. That's way more important to me than money. So it sounds like I've been super judgy about, oh, you should never pirate. But honestly, if you're playing my game and you love my game and you tell me that when I'm 70, so long as I'm not, living on dog food, I'm okay.
Well, that warms my heart to hear. I just on its own. So not that I'm pirating all your games, Andy. I'm not confessing to that, but I do. I think I appreciate your perspective though, because we don't often think about it from that side, and I think it's really valid when you're considering this. So, yeah.
Okay, then I would say, everyone, thank you so very much. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Great chatting with you guys.
Super fun. Thanks so much.
All right,
thanks, everyone.
And we'll finish this off. Yay! Or so
Yay!
we don't have
Yay! You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.